What we are essentially doing is to meet our electricity demands from one of the cleanest source of energy. We cannot afford to continue keeping more than 65 million of our people in the dark.
Ethiopia, the only African nation never colonized, the birthplace of coffee, home to the Blue Nile, the river that feeds Egypt, that feeds Sudan, that feeds a story going back thousands of years. For over 100 million people, this is a country known for ancient churches carved into rock, for runners who dominate the world's marathons, for a coffee ceremony older than most nations on earth. But in 2024, Ethiopia became known for something else, a decision so risky most governments would never dare make it. The country let its own currency float free, no safety net, no gradual transition. Overnight, the government stopped propping up the exchange rate and let the market decide what the bear was actually worth. Economists called it reckless. Critics called it a gamble that could collapse the economy in months. Before, a currency crisis so severe that ordinary Ethiopians were paying black market rates just to get dollars for medicine, fuel, machinery parts. Now, 18 months later, the numbers are in, and they tell a very different story. Growth above 9%, inflation cut in half, reserves climbing for the first time in years. How does a country with this much history flip the switch on its entire economy and come out stronger? That's what this is about. To understand the gamble, you have to understand what it replaced. For nearly 2 decades, Ethiopia ran on a different model. State-led, public investment heavy, roads, dams, railways, built at speed, financed by debt. It worked for a while. Some of the fastest growth rates on the continent year after year, but underneath the growth, cracks were forming. The bear was pegged artificially. That meant the government decided what a dollar was worth in bear, not the market. The gap between the official rate and the real rate on the street widened every year. Importers couldn't get dollars through the bank, so they went to the parallel market and paid whatever premium the street demanded. Foreign currency reserves shrank to a few weeks of import cover. A few weeks. That's the buffer between a functioning economy and a country that can't pay for fuel, fertilizer, or medicine shipments. Debt was building the same way. Ethiopia had borrowed heavily to build. By the early 2020s, it was in distress, and it defaulted on parts of its external obligations, including elements of a sovereign euro bond. For a country that prided itself on self-directed development, that default was a gut punch. Inflation, meanwhile, was eating households alive. At its peak, prices were rising more than 30% a year. A bag of teff, a liter of cooking oil, a bus fare. All of it more expensive by the month, while wages stood still. This was the old reality, a state model running out of road, propped up by a currency peg that was quietly bleeding the country dry. Something had to give. In July 2024, it gives. The government floats the beer, lets the exchange rate move to whatever the market says it's worth. At the same time, it opens up current account transactions, the flow of money in and out of the country, and stops the central bank from simply printing money to cover budget gaps. The immediate effect is brutal. The beer devalues sharply against the dollar. In pure numbers, Ethiopia's GDP, measured in US dollars, takes a hit overnight. Critics pounce. This is the collapse they warned about, they say. But here's the but/therefore moment. The government does not reverse course. Instead, it pairs the float with a modern interest rate-based monetary policy framework, the kind of tool central banks in stable economies use to actually manage inflation, instead of just printing their way through it. Therefore, something the peg could never do finally happens. The real exchange rate, the true value of the bear, adjusted for what things actually cost, starts correcting itself. The gap between the street rate and the bank rate begins closing. The enemy of progress here isn't a foreign power or a rival state. It's structural distortion. Years of currency mismanagement that made every import artificially expensive and every dollar of foreign currency a battle to obtain. The hero of sovereignty is the physical proof that follows. Coffee, Ethiopia's oldest export, the crop that put the country on the world trade map centuries ago. In the year after the flood, coffee export volumes surge, hundreds of metric tons more moving through the ports than before. Because farmers and exporters are finally being paid a rate that reflects reality, not a government-set fiction. Mission gold. With global prices high and the currency reform removing the incentive to smuggle gold out through informal channels, official gold exports climb. Miners bring their product through the formal system instead of around it, because for the first time, the formal system pays close to what the gold is actually worth. Watch the reserves chart. From a few precarious weeks of import cover, foreign currency reserves creep past 2 months. Not abundant, but climbing. For the first time in years, climbing instead of shrinking. But the tension doesn't end with the currency. It moves to debt. Ethiopia is still in default on parts of its external obligations when the reform begins. This is not a footnote. This is the sword hanging over the entire recovery. No investor fully trusts a currency float without also trusting that the debt behind it gets resolved. Therefore, negotiation. Through 2025, Ethiopia works an agreement with its official creditor committee, a memorandum of understanding designed to restore debt sustainability without another default, without another shock to a population that has already absorbed enough. Bilateral deals start advancing. Each one closed is one more brick in the wall between Ethiopia and the kind of debt spiral that has swallowed other developing economies whole. And through all of it, one project looms larger than any currency chart or debt negotiation, the physical hero of this entire story, the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. By 2025, it is fully advancing toward completion. Africa's largest hydropower project, generating more than 5,000 megawatts at capacity. That is more than double what Ethiopia's grid could produce before. Concrete, turbines, transmission lines, a physical structure holding back a river and, with it, holding up an entire industrialization strategy. Built largely with domestic financing, not a foreign loan carrying foreign conditions. Ethiopian money, Ethiopian labor, Ethiopian engineers on Ethiopian soil. The dam is already exporting power to Kenya, to Djibouti, to Sudan. Optimistic projections put potential export revenue in the hundreds of millions of dollars a year, climbing toward $1 billion if regional cooperation holds. But regional cooperation is not guaranteed. Egypt and Sudan have downstream concerns about water flow that predate this documentary and will outlast it. The dam is a triumph of engineering and a live political fault line at the same time. That tension does not resolve neatly, it simply becomes the backdrop against which everything else plays out. Meanwhile, on the ground, the industrial story compounds. Manufacturing recovers, construction rebounds. Industrial parks, built during the earlier state-led era, finally have reliable power to run at capacity instead of half capacity. Mining, boosted by the gold price boom and the currency reform, becomes a genuine growth engine instead of a leak in the system. Agriculture adds its own chapter. Irrigation expansion, cluster farming, grouping smallholder plots to farm at a scale that actually supports mechanization. A wheat self-sufficiency push, with official figures showing strong gains even if outside estimates are more cautious about how far the country has actually come. Layer all of it together, and the picture that emerges is not one dramatic villain defeated in a single scene. It's a slower, harder war against currency distortion, against debt fragility, against decades of underinvestment in the power grid, fought on 5 fronts at once, with results that show up not in a single headline but in a stack of indicators, all moving the same direction. Poverty has not been solved. Youth unemployment remains high. The economy is still heavily agricultural, still exposed to drought, still carrying real conflict risk in parts of the country. Per capita income in dollar terms took a real hit from the devaluation, a cost that lands hardest on people who don't hold assets in foreign currency to begin with. This is not a fairy tale ending. It's a country mid-fight with the early rounds going better than expected. So where does this leave Ethiopia right now? In 2026, growth sits near 9%, among the fastest of any large economy on the continent. Inflation, once above 30%, now sits closer to 10%. The IMF's extended credit facility, approved in mid-2024, remains in place, a vote of institutional confidence that the reform path is holding. The state is stepping back from the driver's seat it held for 2 decades. Banking is opening to foreign participation. The Commercial Bank of Ethiopia has been recapitalized. Loss-making state enterprises are being forced to recognize their losses instead of hiding them. Fuel and electricity prices are moving toward cost recovery instead of open-ended subsidy. This is the shift from a government that built everything itself to a government that sets the rules and lets the market, the farmers, the miners, and the private investors do the building. The Renaissance Dam stands as the physical proof that the old model and the new one aren't fully separate. It was built the state-led way, and now it powers the market-led way. Sovereignty didn't disappear when the government stepped back. It just changed shape, from control over every input to control over the conditions that let others produce. And Ethiopia isn't walking this road entirely alone. Full BRICS membership from 2024 opens new partnerships, new markets, new sources of investment outside the traditional Western-led financial system. Quiet South-South ties are deepening too, including with Burkina Faso, where diplomatic exchanges since 2024 have focused not on massive capital flows but on something arguably more durable: shared training programs, industrial know-how, and security cooperation between two governments navigating their own versions of the same sovereignty question. The story isn't finished. The debt deal isn't fully closed. The dam's downstream politics aren't resolved. Reform fatigue is a real risk in any country asking its population to absorb this much change this fast. But the direction is set, and the physical evidence is already standing. Turbines spinning on the Blue Nile, coffee moving through the ports at record volume, reserves climbing instead of vanishing. The next chapter is the debt deal's final signature, and whether the dam's regional politics settle into cooperation or conflict. That's the story we'll be watching next.